30 Odd Minutes is sponsored in part by Digital Dowsing. Who are you powered by?
For the next 30 minutes, we will explore the unexplained. From mysteries beyond our galaxy to ghostly phenomenon in our own backyard. We will dive into our psychic abilities and explore everything from conspiracies to the just plain weird. Welcome to 30 Odd Minutes. If the truth is out there, we will find it. But only by sheer accident.
Oh, yeah. Man, nice landing.
Oh.
Gosh, it's
Man, it's warm,
very warm in here. Where are
Where
we?
the hell? Oh. Ooh. That's exactly where we are.
Nice. We seem to be in hell, which is probably appropriate because we're going to talk about demons tonight.
Oh, perfect.
I know, it is perfect. Engine room, are you there? Can you tell me what's going on, Matt?
We're in hell. That explains the overheating.
Yeah.
But there's one thing to look forward to. Up is the only direction we can go from here.
That's true. Sometimes rock bottom is comforting, right?
Yeah, that's true.
It kind of is.
Good point.
All right. Speaking of hell, the other day I was in a place called Purgatory Chasm, which is in Sutton, Massachusetts. It's an amazing place, really interesting, but they have some features that I think pertain to tonight's show, like this one. Check it out. The Devil's Coffin. It's this little cave, and it's got this rock. You can see it looks like kind of like a slate, like the top of a box, I guess. And so the Devil's Coffin, and when you get closer, you can see on the wall there's this little engraving that's probably at least 100 years old. Tough to see here, but it says, "Prepare to meet thy God." And, ominous, right?
Yeah, I would say so.
And it got me thinking about New Englanders, but people in general, right? We're infatuated with the devil.
Oh, there's places called Hell and Devil all over southern New England.
Hell's Gates, right?
Yeah.
There's all these things. It's a prominent figure. These are our puritanical roots. The figure comes up again and again. But what happens when that becomes a real force in your life?
It's more fun when it's a picnic area.
Totally more fun when you take some pictures and you go home. So that's kind of what we're talking about tonight, and I think it's interesting. You remember when ghosts were all the rage, right?
Oh yeah, sure.
Ghosts totally like
a little blasé nowadays.
10 years ago.
Yeah, people are looking for the big guy.
Got to be demons, right? There's demonologists everywhere.
That's right.
I myself am a Satanologist. I don't get out of bed for anything less than Satan himself.
Okay.
So when you've got the minor demons, you call the other guys.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
You let me know when it's the real thing. But it's all the rage. And we're going to talk about that tonight. What's the difference between an angry ghost?
Yeah. Just a miserable ghost, or maybe Beelzebub,
or something elemental, or
exactly,
what have you.
Exactly.
So we're going to get into it. We're going to talk about a very specific case with two guests tonight.
How are we doing that?
I have no idea. But with technology and the mothership, I think good things will happen. So, shall we jump in?
Sure, let's go.
Right. Here's the story, Andrew. When a woman in her Gainesville, Florida home was dealing with forces she didn't understand, she reached out to tonight's guests for help. She was experiencing objects moving on their own, plus she was being thrown around and attacked by unseen forces. Our guests then embarked on a spiritual journey and warfare against this evil entity in a battle that took a heavy toll on pretty much all involved. They documented this journey and ordeal in their new book, Demon Street USA, the true story of a very haunted house. Please welcome David Rountree and Robbie Lunt.
Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi there.
Good evening.
All right, great to have you guys with us. We appreciate it. Robbie, I want to start with you, if that's okay. Tell us how you first heard about the problems in this Gainesville homes, this street.
Penelope, we were sitting by the side of the Swanee River. Had some time to kill, and she started telling me about this problem she was having with this big black eye that would pull her out of her body every night and would actually take her around the property that she lived on, and it sounded pretty bad. But we got busy again, and I forgot about it for about 2.5, 3 months. After that time, I went to visit a friend of mine, and sitting back in the corner of the room in the dark, this woman leaned forward, and it blew my mind. It was Penny again, but she looked completely different. Her hair was all puffed out, and she looked like Grandmama from the Addams Family. Big, deep, dark circles under her eyes, and she proceeded to tell me this story of being so afraid in her house that she went to her landlord's property. And on her landlord's property that night, she had been sleeping, and she woke up to the stove dancing in this kitchen. and then the wave that went through the floor and picked her up, tossed her around, and dropped her. At that point, she ran and left the property, and we were able to then get together, and that's when I called my friend Dave. And you know, it was funny. It was a lark. We were just going to go see a haunted house, and
Right.
it turned out to be much more than that.
So, right. So, Dave, let's talk about your first impressions when you get involved with this case now. What do you think when you go down? What's the difference between, you know, Casper, the maybe somewhat angry ghost, and something more demonic?
I think we noticed it as soon as we crossed over from the street onto the property. The property itself had a ditch around the entire property of where the three houses sat, which was very common in Gainesville for drainage during our monsoon season. Most of the areas had drainage ditches around the houses, and this ditch had water in it. Once we crossed that water, my words for it was like someone set a grand piano on my back, and Robbie described it as having a gorilla on his back. But it was immediately very oppressive. The air was thick. It was hard to breathe. There was just an overall feeling or sense of foreboding as soon as we touched onto the property. And it pretty much went downhill pretty rapidly after that. It didn't take us very long to figure out we were not dealing with just an angry ghost or a displaced spirit or some type of nature spirit that had gone awry or whatever. There was something very sinister and dark there.
Now, here's what's interesting to me. I've known David Rountree for a number of years now, and Dave, you've always struck me as a gear guy, right? Like you're an electrical engineer. You've got all kinds of degrees and background in that, but the gear wasn't really called for in this case, was it?
Well, the thing was we didn't have the gear in 1985 that we have today either. When I started out in 76, we were dealing with reel-to-reel tape recorders that weighed, 70 pounds, and we didn't have the equipment available to the general public we had today. There were no computers, no internet, no cell phones, no laptops, none of that. I was also on a spiritual journey as well that isn't real well known. In fact, this book is probably introducing a whole lot of people to that part of my background. But I had a very spiritual part, and in my early days, I was kind of like Hans Holzer, where I would rely upon spirituality means as well as equipment means to do investigative work. In this case, we went to have a good time, and once we got there, we didn't need equipment to tell us what was going on. We knew. It was a matter of helping someone get rid of something that was destroying their life, and equipment no longer became an issue. We didn't have to prove anything to anybody. We were busy trying to get rid of this thing, and of course, they don't make a demon be gone piece of equipment yet. And when they do, I'll be probably one of the first people to buy one, but we didn't have any of that back then. So it was more of a concentrated spiritual kind of battle, spiritual kind of journey for both Robbie and myself.
So, Robbie, talk about your experiences when you're in this house. Do you have a moment where you're scared, where you feel like you're being attacked?
When we went into the property, I think that I was in shock. I think that my mind was frozen in a way that allowed me to go around the property and experience everything and still just keep stumbling on. I was pretty terrified the whole time. When you watch windows open, crank windows, jalousie windows that you have to crank open, and you watch them opening, yet the gears aren't moving, it gets unnerving. I was even given the nice gift of a spider crawling up my arm, and for somebody who's arachnophobic, that just even in and of itself was really frightening, yet I think I was so in shock I just reached down and flicked it off my arm. I was terrified the whole time, but we had to finish what we had started. So you couldn't be that scared. You had to deflect it with our humor.
Well, let's talk about the spiritual journey that you talked about, both of you being on. What does that mean? Is this part of your awakening, you think, dealing with this case, saying like, oh my gosh, there's a lot more to the world than I thought before? I mean, talk about those early stages. Let's start with you, David, and then we'll jump over to Robbie.
Well, I was already a practicing shaman. I practiced wolf medicine. And at the time, however, I was practicing coyote medicine. And Robbie had been bugging me to learn the path for a long time, and Power just never really pointed him out to me to do that with. And then this event sort of had power point him out to me. It's like I knew I had to teach him something or he could die. And that's really what started the whole thing of he becoming my first apprentice and me trying to teach him everything that I had gained over a period of 5 or 6 years into like 2 or 3 months. And then trying to find out information on what we were dealing with at the same time. So for me, it was a spiritual journey in that I learned how to pass on my knowledge to him. And his journey, of course, is something completely different.
Right. Well, Robbie, tell us about your journey. You know, how does this case fit in with that?
You know, for me, it was you can have a lot of book learning, a lot of that kind of knowledge, but to truly understand something, you have to experience it. And this whole book was the story of my getting kick-started on the proper path. There's a lot of times where you can look for paths and you can look for it, and there's a term called dharma shopping. And some people get caught up in that kind of search. Spirit decided that I needed to be on the path I needed to be on immediately and set this wonderful obstacle in my path. And Dave was kind enough to be there to keep me from jumping in way in over my head.
Sure. No, understood. Now, I'm very curious. You get involved with this case. I understand you're frightened. Things are moving around. That's a scary thing. At what point do you say, this must be a demon? Like, what's the leap from poltergeist, ghost to demon?
I think that was, Dave pretty much stated it earlier. You knew. I already lived in a haunted house at that point. There were 2 ghosts in the house I was living in at that time. So there's a feeling your body gets. And when you deal with a demonic entity, your body reacts in a very specific way. It's totally revolted. It wants to get the heck out of there as soon as possible. It's just a whole different feeling. And people's bodies are able to pick up that minute difference. It really is. It's the weight. It's the smell. It's things that it's not like a normal haunting, and it becomes very apparent very quick, especially when it wants you gone from that property. Don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I knew almost as soon as I set foot on the property that it was something extraordinarily negative or evil. So it wasn't a big search.
Now the Catholic boy in me, raised Catholic, right. Understand about the process of exorcism and right. things like that. Are your thoughts ever to call in a Catholic priest or an exorcist of some kind, as opposed to dealing with this yourselves?
Well, an exorcism only works when it's in a person. We didn't have that situation in this case. We had a piece of property that was active with a demonic presence. And the only thing the Catholic Church can do in that case is put a blessing there. And blessings were put on the property to no avail. In fact, it became very obvious early on that Christian methods of dealing with it were completely ineffective. And it made a big point to point that out. So we knew that, and remember, this is 1985. You don't just waltz into a church and say, I got a demon over here on 6th Street. People lock you up.
Right. So
everything was done very carefully originally, but Christian banishments had no effect on this. And that was our first clue that we were in for deep problems.
Okay, so...
However, I do have to point out, for our final ceremony, we did use holy water that was blessed by a Catholic priest, because quite frankly, when you're dealing with demons, they have the history, they've got the background, and we were taking help from wherever it would come.
Exactly. So it was a hodgepodge of tools that were used.
So you guys, you're looking at this situation, you know in your gut and your heart you're not dealing with a ghost. What was the first battle plans you laid out? You guys must have gone off, talked about it, and said, okay, when we go back to the property, this is the first thing we're going to do.
Yeah, it didn't work out that way. We had never dealt with anything like this before. I had never dealt with anything like it before. We didn't know what to do. In fact, we didn't even know what we were, who we were dealing with. And so we started doing a lot of research, and we started going to different things. I mean, we went to a psychic fair. We went to talk to different people along the way to gather information. It was a long process. Even though it only took 3 months, it seemed like 30 years the way time traveled when we were doing it. But yeah, it was very difficult to form any kind of strategy because most everything we did was reactive. It would throw something at us and we would react to it. Robbie particularly was the target of much of that. He had a lot of things occur to him. In fact, it came into his house. It chased him down a dark highway when he was driving in a car. I mean, he had a lot of personal experiences with this where I did not. So he's probably a better person to explain some of that than I am.
Yeah, Robbie, tell us about what are the things that followed you, that were outside of that house? What kind of things were you experiencing?
It was, it was a fairly constant activity. It was kind of funny. The ghosts that were in my house got rather reactive, too. Anytime this thing would come around the house itself, the ghosts would get all upset, and then we'd have to deal with the flickering lights and that thing from that ghost. It wasn't confined to the property, and I think that was another thing that really got us going about what was happening. It was interesting. Things were coming out of the woodwork. People would appear out of nowhere and just drop these bombs on us that, well, this is what I think you need to, and we would be flabbergasted, but when we'd sit back and then examine the information that was coming in, we could discern things. It's like, that makes a lot of sense. And so while we really didn't have a plan and we were just going at it, we were being given guidance. It was, things could not actually interact, but they could still guide us along. And that was really a huge thing that helped.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Our strategy formed over a period of time until that exact final moment. I mean, it really did.
Well, hold on. We're going to want to hear about that exact final moment in a minute, but we're going to take a break for the news. And when we come back, we're going to be talking a little bit more about Demon Street, USA, the true story of a very haunted house by David Rountree and Robbie Lunt. We'll be right back after the news.
In August of 2014, a man was arrested by police in Portsmouth, England, for impersonating a ghost. The phony phantom was identified as one Anthony Stollard, who, along with some of his mates, decided that the graveyard at the Kingston Church would be a great place to play football, despite the fact that there were people visiting their loved ones' graves. Witnesses called the local police and reported seeing a young man running about the graveyard, waving his arms above his head and saying, "Ooh." Stollard was arrested for disturbing the peace, fined 75 English pounds, and he will also have to serve 3 months in jail for violating a court agreement on previous charges. Maybe next time pick a more appropriate location and try a little harder on the visual. I'm Andrew Lake, and oddly enough, that's the news.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, some people need to get a life.
Yeah,
Really
faking
do.
stuff, though. Someone just this past weekend, we did an event at Edaville
Yes.
Railroad. They were showing me some photos they took, and it's that app that puts the ghost or monster into any picture that you take, And they're like, hey, look at this, I'm like, we haven't seen it yet.
Yeah.
But it's getting harder today.
It is.
It is. The technology's so good, you can insert in an app, for free, and faking stuff. And here's the interesting thing to me, people want to get on TV shows and all that other stuff. In 1985, not so much the case. Yeah. So I think it's interesting that we're talking about a case a few decades ago, because that was a different time. It's tough, I think, for modern paranormal fans to remember when ghosts were in the closet.
That's right. I try to explain it to people myself.
Yeah.
I just can't imagine a time when it was that difficult to be a ghost hunter.
And it is. So when you guys are doing this research, David and Robbie, how do you go about it in a time when, people would be looking at you funny, threatening to lock you up, fire you from your job, whatever, What was that like?
Well, you can't go on Google because it doesn't exist. And everything's word of mouth. I knew people, Robbie knew people. We did a lot of work in libraries, remember those, where they had good old-fashioned books. Sure. Did a lot of research that way. We did research at the University of Florida Library, at local libraries. We looked up land records. We did all sorts of things the good old-fashioned way by hand. There's something still to be said for that, because that in itself is a journey. But it was difficult. We things would happen in our path. Like we would pick up the paper one day, and for example, there would be a psychic fair that day downtown. So we would go to it, and we would all go, and things would happen, and people would give us things. give us things that were needful things we would need. And how that would happen would always amaze us, as Robbie alluded to earlier. People would just come out of the woodwork and say, you need this. And they wouldn't even say why we needed it. They would just say, you need this.
Well, give us an example. What would they give you?
Well, we spoke with this medium who was from Jacksonville. Her name was Ruth. Oh gosh, can't think of her last name now.
Ruth.
But
I'm just trying to help.
was it?
I'm just kidding. I don't know Ruth.
I'm having brain death here occurring. But anyway, Ruth said that there was. It's written in the book, but the end result was that she carried us out to her car, opened her trunk, and she was going to give us a crystal, a quartz crystal, but the one she had on her wasn't good enough, according to her. So she had to get one out of her trunk. She said that we needed the big gun. And when she reached into her trunk to get it, it cut her. It cut her bad. She was bleeding.
Huh.
And her words were, I can't believe they don't want me to give you this. And then she gave it to us anyway, and she also gave us a prayer to use, which the prayer is also listed in the book and the final encounter there. But it was things like that, just out of the blue. We walked into this fair, and everyone in the fair, purposefully, were looking at their laps, looking at their fingers. They did everything they could to avoid looking at us. And she was the only one. She just sat there and was all smiley and grinning and looking at us, and her poor client was crying their eyes out in front of her over some who knows what problem she was having. But Ruth was just beaming away at us, and that's how things occurred. I mean, that was not unusual. That was typical for what happened during the process. People just came and gave us things.
One of the things I think is great, guys, is you're talking about the old-fashioned research of, going to libraries, but something else you said, word of mouth. And that's something, Andrew, I know you've got experience with. You can't just get on the internet, right? Talking to people.
No, and know people. It's like people who have had an experience before, and they know people, and it's a close-knit network of people, and that's how it was back then.
Sure.
I mean, it wasn't like it is today where everybody has a ghost story.
Right.
There was a handful of people you might know that had some experience, and you went to them and you talked. And they told you what they knew, and you built off of that. And it was kind of like putting a jigsaw puzzle together.
But
we were lucky. We were lucky too because we worked in the entertainment business, and every theater you go into is haunted. So everyone that we worked with, and Penelope was married to somebody that we worked with, has had at least a minor experience or knows somebody who's had an experience, because that's just the way the theater is. And for the most part, the people that work in that industry, although we know how all the tricks are done, so we're very skeptical when we first see something, because we have that level of skepticism, we can also debunk it really quick and go, I can't explain this. What the heck is it?
Sure.
So it makes a diff.
Now, do you guys feel like at some point, were you able to identify this demonic entity? Did it have a name?
We did feel like we had to identify it. We knew for sure we had to identify its nature. In other words, what mythos did it belong to? It was pretty obvious that it predated Christianity and pretty much everything else that we threw at it. So we had to look for, a really ancient source for it. And we got clues to that when we were actually in Clevis's house. His personal library was incredible. He had books that are legendary, books that aren't supposed to even exist. And he had hardbound copies of them that were, leather-bound and vellum, handwritten, stuff written in Latin, Greek, Egyptian hieroglyphics, clay tablets with cuneiforms on them. I mean, this guy had quite a collection for a redneck.
Yeah, right. Now, so I'm curious, too, now, as this stuff is building up, what are the homeowners going through? What's their life like?
Clevis, these were his protectors. These were his friends, his guardians, his relatives. He was all down with it. In fact, we were only able to go to the property 3 times because after a while we had everything so riled up there that he threatened not only to call the police on us, but he threatened to get the demon to chase us down. But he was already a little late on that one. It was already had our scent and was already going after us. But the homeowner thought it was the best thing ever. He enjoyed it. He told stories of looking at living in one of the apartments overlooking the house and watching a bunch of frat boys come running out of the house one night, just screaming because they had also seen the dancing stove. He thought it was a hoot. So, yeah, the tenant was having a problem, but the landowner and the property owner thought it was great.
Now, a question for you guys. When you said, you're going to the libraries and you were doing, all kinds of research on history, what did you guys find out about the property that may have suggested why this was going on? Did you find any historic reference to anything that might explain why this property was tainted?
Yeah, Robbie, why don't you tell them what you found?
It was really interesting. There's a great tradition in the South that if you don't talk about something, it goes away. And we were trying to we figured out that the property had belonged to Clevis's Clevis was the landowner. His grandfather had been a huge landowner in a county that was right over from where ours was. But you couldn't find any information about him. You found him on the land rolls, but all the little histories were pretty much whitewashed. And that part got really, really tough. We had trouble getting any kind of history, and it's only been since the advent of Google that we found out that he owned a bit of property where there was a nice little township on that in I believe it was 32, it disappeared off of every single map because there had been an altercation and a misidentification, and the white people of the county wiped the black township off of the map. They killed everyone, man, woman, child. There were a few escapees who managed to pull the tail out, but it was a horrible, horrible thing.
They made a movie about it, actually. The movie was called Rosewood.
Okay, wow. And so, that's, that's a powerful thing. And we've talked in the past about how horrible acts like that leave a stain.
Exactly.
Leave a stain that doesn't get washed away. And would you say that's kind of almost like an opening for these demonic forces?
Well, this property wasn't where that property was, which was the strange thing about it. But the area where this happened, we have a friend that lives there today, and she has a lot of trouble with the property herself. There's a lot of activity out there she has trouble dealing with. But this property was actually in the city of Gainesville proper, but it also belonged to Clevis's grandfather.
Gotcha.
And I believe the library that we witnessed in Clevis's house had been his grandfather's library. Some of the books were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars just as collector items as the book, as an ancient book.
Amazing. So guys, we're running almost out of time, but I'm curious, how does it end? Are you successful in clearing this property of the demonic forces?
Well, we're
still alive.
Nice. How'd they do that? That was good.
Yeah, we're still here.
Yeah.
So we obviously were successful. But people have to realize that these things can't be killed. You can banish them for a period of time, but someone can conjure them back just as quick as Jack Sprat. It's a matter of conjuring, of opening a door and inviting something in. So you can get rid of it, but no banishment is permanent.
And are you, Robbie, now that you've got some years of perspective to look on it, do you have some thoughts on dealing with something like this again?
Well, the thing is nowadays all of these people are seeing demons everywhere, and as an entity, demons are very, very far and few between. Even the professed demonologists may have once or barely touched upon this. So, I've had to deal with it in the years that have gone by, but for the most part, what you usually find in places are angry elementals, angry nature spirits. A ghost, as Dave is so wont to say, a ghost or a person that was a butthead in real life is going to be a butthead ghost in the afterlife.
So true. All right, guys, we are right up out of time. I appreciate you coming on. The book is called Demon Street USA, The True Story of a Very Haunted House by David Rountree and Robbie Lunt. We'll, of course, have links to the book and to their websites from ours. From Andrew, from Matt, from Eric, and all of us. Until next time, stay odd.
Thank you.